So welcome to Everything Digital Health. As a bit of a change from our usual format, I'm going to talk about some of the previous topics that I've covered in other presentations over the years. And one of them is open source. And I've become quite outspoken and I guess known for views on open source in medicine. And so I'm going to represent one of those presentations that I've done in the past. This one is called Open Source is the Only Way for Medicine, Procurement Edition, because there is an element of this which starts to address procurement issues which we have in the NHS. And I think after attending a number of different events in the last few years, one of the things that started to unify the theme was that procurement is now such a big problem that nobody can achieve anything in the NHS because all the tools that they need have to be procured, and that immediately brings in an enormous backlog, or it prevents progress because people are forced to wait for procurement to have happened. And it also means that it cuts down the available options, because out of hand, we're often dismissing the idea of building custom software in open source for the NHS because procurements like to buy things that are already commercial off-the-shelf products. Inherently, commercial off-the-shelf, when it's in the NHS context, is actually a bit of a lie, because very rarely do you procure something and immediately get an off-the-shelf product. That the metaphor that's being used is the idea that you pay for something, you get the thing, you can use it in the same way as, buying an iPhone or something. It's an off-the-shelf iPhone. It's not a bespoke iPhone. But the reality of that in the NHS is that it's never actually off the shelf. You are always paying for customization, and you never own the software, you never own the customizations, and they can never be shared between NHS organizations. So inherently, we get all the worst side of bespoke software and all the worst side of commercial off-the-shelf software, and we pay vastly over the odds for both of those privileges. Anyway, I first gave this talk at the Let's Do Digital webinar in early 2025, I think it was. And so here goes. Open source is the only way for medicine. That's what I firmly believe. I can go into more detail of how that works. I've got another partner presentation, which I will also record, which goes into more of the ethics of why I think open source is the only way for medical software. But in a very tiny nutshell, it is that medicine is a very ancient profession, and one of the underpinning central ethical tenets of medicine is that we would share the things that have been learnt and evaluate them and assess them, and that allows for progress to happen. When you don't share scientific endeavor, you get sort of alchemy. People say things work, but there's no way of proving that they work. Since we had the sort of age of enlightenment and science being something that would be shared between other scientists and reevaluated and checked, that's when progress started to happen. So that's been the case now for almost all of clinical medicine. But in the last couple of decades, we've kind of lost our grip on the software. Software is as much part of clinical medicine as knowing how to do a surgical procedure or knowing the formula for a drug. If we don't stand unified as a profession and say we demand to have access to the software, then we will lose it, and part of medicine will become proprietary, and that will be bad for people's health, and it will be bad for the profession of medicine. So that's my sort of position in a nutshell. I am Marcus Bohr. I'm a self-described general hacktitioner, which means I have a clinical background, but I'm a software developer. I'm self-taught. That other better software developers are available, but for a doctor who can code, I'm probably quite good at coding for a doctor. I'm quite good at medicine for a coder. I'm occupying that sort of middle space. I run a lot of forums across health and digital. I built the RCPCH's digital growth charts with a small team at the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. And there's a couple of other projects that I've been involved in, which were big, ballsy projects like creating an NHS Ubuntu operating system for the NHS and creating an open source GP system. Before that, I had a fully clinical medical career. And these slides are online at that URL, which I'll put in the description. So open source is the only way for medicine. It's also the only way to avoid procurement death. And I think what I'm trying to get at is that there is so much difficulty with with procurement that we need to find more creative ways around it rather than just to enter into endless procurement. So first of all, what is open source? It is software which releases its source code openly, publicly, and users get some additional rights depending on the license. So you generally have the right to see and modify the code. Depending on the license, you might also be required to feed your improvements back into the original project, but not always. So that depends entirely on the license, and it would still be required as be regarded as open source. Those licenses depend on the individual project. So you can, if you want to know what the rights are and the responsibilities that come with them, you go to the source code repository or the project website, and it will say there in the license. Open source does not mean that you can't make any money out of it and that it's non-commercial. So that's one of the big fallacies that people often believe, that open source is somehow entirely free ecosystem and therefore it's antithetical to companies and making money on open source. And that's just not true. There's a huge amount of the internet runs on open source software, and the services around those pieces of software are provided by commercial companies who often do very well out of it. So it's very encouraging as a commercial environment. In fact, it possibly is more encouraging than a closed source environment, because if you imagine an open source project might have services delivered around it by dozens of different companies, all with an equal access to the source code and equal ability to provide services. Whereas a closed commercial off-the-shelf type of solution, you can only buy the services from the company who own the source code. And that can mean that you're essentially in a monopoly situation where you have no options. So open source gives you a lot of commercial options, both as a supplier, a provider of services, and as a consumer of services. Doesn't mean it's free, and some software is paid for open source. Others, the software is free, but the services cost you money. And that is one of the strengths of this area. The transparency means that the security of the software can be looked at by many hundreds or thousands of different people if needed. We can look at the source code and we can find those errors and those bugs before they cause us problems. So it tends to drive up quality and safety. That is not a complete panacea, and I will admit that there are undoubtedly pieces of open source software out there that are not perfect. But the fundamental difference is that you can see how not perfect the software is. Whereas closed source software, you're not allowed to see how imperfect the software is. It will be imperfect because there is no such thing as perfect software, but you're not allowed to know how good the software is that you're using, and yet you're going to be paying for it, and you're going to stake a lot of your business and your organization's reputation on that software. Some examples of open source software, things like Android, the base operating system of Android, the base Chromium browser. These are open source projects on which Google have built more extensions, not all of which are open source, but the basics underneath them are open source. Linux, Apache web server, MediaWiki, which powers Wikipedia, WordPress, and the Discourse Forum. These are all open source projects. So how can it how can you hack your way around procurement? So given what I was saying about procurement before, we do have a problem with procurement now. There is a very small pool of very bad solutions that we can procure. I think that's probably number one problem, is that there isn't much to go and buy. Almost everything that you want to buy as an electronic patient record in the NHS is shit. It's absolutely unusable, pathetic attempts at elderly, creaky software. So even if you had the process of procurement absolutely perfected, you can only buy what's out there, and what's out there is rubbish. So we haven't got good stuff to buy. In addition to that, our processes of procurement are a blocker to progress themselves. So we suddenly realize that in order to deliver a project for the NHS, that we're going to have to procure some software. And immediately that puts the brakes on. It means that now we're going straight into waterfall mode, because somebody will say, we need to know what the software should do. So that's now a specifications gathering exercise. So we start collecting requirements and we put them in a spreadsheet or a massive Word document. And before you know it, we've got 90 pages of PDF or more of what this thing should do. And it's everything to everyone. That then has to be reconciled with what's available, which, as we've already encountered, is not that great. There's not much out there. So are we procuring a bespoke piece of software? Are we procuring something that's commercial off the shelf? To be honest, even during procurement, most people still don't know which it is that they're doing. They often think that they're getting commercial off the shelf software because that relates back to whether this is capital spend or whether it's recurring revenue and for VAT purposes, and all kinds of financial craziness gets involved. We're not 5 minutes into the process. We've already forgotten what it's for. And so procurement, as it stands currently, results in really poor outcomes for the purchasing, as in we end up with bad software. It costs us a lot of money and it takes a long time. So that lengthy and expensive procurement process has killed off really good ideas in the past. But I believe open source can be used to hack your way around those procurement roadblocks. So in this case, what I'm advocating is that if you need something like a content management system with open source, you can actually immediately try out some and see which ones suit your workflows best, and straight away you're using something and you're starting to make forward progress. You can't do that with closed source procured solutions. Once you've decided what you want, then your internal IT capability can support it potentially, or you pay for commercial support. So if you decide you want a WordPress CMS, well, you can get a WordPress CMS genuinely off the shelf from a number of different WordPress providers. Equally, if you'd chosen a different system, there are other providers who can provide that service, and you've got the option to move between them with relatively little friction. So you could move from one provider of hosting to another provider of hosting without any downtime, and taking all your data with you, which is something you cannot say for pretty much any other proprietary piece of software. It only works like that for open source, to be honest. We all say that we should be working in an agile way, but you can't procure in an agile way. I just talked a bit about the about the procurement process, and it's definitely not agile. The first thing you do is write a big specifications document. Now that immediately makes it waterfall. You are deciding what you want. You go out to the market. Companies compete to pretend that they will give you what you want, and then you don't get what you want, and you've now paid all your money and you've no levers left. Agile is about rapid and iterative experimentation. You can't do that when it's a proprietary product, but you can do it in open source. You can also, this doesn't necessarily allude to building your own open source stuff, which is what we mean by agile development. You can experiment with 3 or 4 different platforms that might do the thing you want. So this isn't so much the software development agile, this is the project delivery agile. This is where somebody says, we need something to do this function. Let's say it's going to be sending SMS texts to patients. We need a platform that will enable us to do that. Well, there are going to be dozens of those. Some are proprietary, some are open source. But with the open source ones, you can try them out right away, do some testing, and you'll immediately have an answer to, does this work for us or not? You can do that inside something like a 2-week experimental agile cycle. You cannot do a procurement inside that 2-week experimental agile cycle. Iteration is important for getting things better. So almost everything that we use in daily life is a result of iterative development. So gradually pieces of technology get slightly better and slightly better and slightly better. Importantly, to iterate on something, you have to be able to look at how the old version worked and then make a better one on top. If you can't look inside how the old version worked, then it's much harder to be iterative. So whereas with a physical object, some kind of some piece of technology like a radiator valve, you can buy one, take it to bits and find out how it's done, and you can maybe make a better one. If software is all closed source, you can't take it to bits. You can't get inside and have a look at how it's built, and you can't make it better. Large, difficult things like the internet are the result of iterative development. And you could argue all of human society and civilization, iterative development. The idea that you can just build something monolithic and closed and they will work perfectly and never need to be improved is a lie. Open source does iterative better than anything else for the reasons I went through before. You can try it, you can improve it, you can look at the source code, you can improve that source code, you can feed back those improvements into the project as well. So everybody else gets your iterative developments. In the NHS, we could make a lot more use of in-house development, and we do have developers across the NHS. We have quite a large developer resource. The problem is we don't enable them to work together on single projects that unify the NHS. So where we do have developers, they'll either be working on something that is only used in one trust and never shared outside that trust, or they'll be working on some central projects like the spine, for example. But we've got some success stories where in-house development has really delivered the goods. So the NHS spine was originally built as an outsourced external project by some contractors, but the spine 2 allowed the running of that spine to be in-housed again. So it was brought back in-house. There were contractors involved in the replatforming, but the entire infrastructure of that spine was built from open source components. The actual spine source code itself is not open source, but the components that were used to build it are open source. And we reused lots of existing big projects, like, for example, Splunk was used for logging and examining the log files. Rather than building our own product for that, we just used an off-the-shelf commercial open source project like Splunk. And that was built into the spine 2. NHS app, that's something that's owned by the NHS. It is built using developer time that is outsourced via a contracting company. But you can see how that needn't be a problem. In a way, if you're paying for external developer time, as long as the NHS owns the intellectual property and something is an in-house development that we own, then there's no problem there. And there are a number of Home-brew EPRs where actually user satisfaction is quite high because they recognize that having an in-house team means that there's a much closer relationship and a shorter cycle between clinical need changing and the EPR being able to respond to that clinical need. If you look at the comparative alternative, when clinical needs change and you use proprietary product that's maybe used in dozens of different trusts, you are going to have a great deal of difficulty convincing the owners of that proprietary software, the system supplier, that your change is necessary. It's very difficult to convince them that that's a priority, that they should make this change. And so the cycle, or at least the lead time between needing a change and getting the change, is vastly, vastly more, at least 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more than it would be with a Home-brew EPR. So even though Home-brew EPRs are somewhat sneered at, I think unfairly, across the NHS, actually when you speak to the users of them, they're often relatively satisfied because it does respond to their needs, and there is a closer relationship between the clinicians and end users and the developers. One thing we don't do with these Home-brew EPRs, though, which we should do, is we should be starting to build sort of collaborative groups across the NHS so that we could actually take something that works in one place and offer it as a usable item elsewhere in the NHS, which immediately means that the more organizations you've got involved working on the same open source project, they have all the benefits of the open source. They still get some rapid iterative ability. They still have that closer relationship between developers and the clinicians, but they're now sharing the cost of development. So when a new feature needs to be added, you add it once and 20 NHS trusts get the benefit instead of just 1, or 200 NHS trusts. And that's an absolute killer feature that we're just not using because there's nobody coordinating open source across the NHS. I've spoken to many, many clinicians who have been involved in improving the software of the NHS. And one thing that you find if they've been involved for long enough is that they will have put their heart and soul into a project, and then the project is canned. And this happens quite a lot. It happens whenever there's a major reorganization of the NHS. It happens when leaders change. It happens when funding streams are interrupted, and it can happen when there are political changes outside the NHS and suddenly your project has just gone. And very often that when projects die like that, there will be a comeuppance, as it were, in enough years go by, and somebody will say, oh, it's a real shame we lost all that work, isn't it? Because actually right now that would be super useful. But by then it's too late. Open source is saved game. These are the stupid reasons that your project might be killed, but open source is a saved game. If you as a contributor put a lot of work into something, you have a right to assume that somewhere that work is being saved for posterity, as it were. And by open sourcing it, you do. So that work that's gone into the code, that's gone into documentation, that's gone into the thought process of the open source project means it's saved for the future. If you're not open sourcing your work, you are absolutely at risk of a minor hiccup in funding stream or organizational restructure means that everything you've done was wasted and you've no way of retrieving that. Once it's gone, if you tried to get hold of the supplier and say, oh, I did all this work, can I have a copy of it? They will just tell you, I'm sorry, we don't work for you anymore. Or you don't work for us anymore. Whereas open source means everyone gets a copy of the contributions they've made. And who knows, in the future, when the dust has settled from your organization restructure, somebody realizes, it would be a good idea to have that thing back. And you go, great, I'll just reopen that open source repository and we're back to business as usual. We can start using the learning that we made, that stuff that we built before, to inform the new thing that we're going to build now. Quality and safety, I think I mentioned at the beginning, this is something I'm going to whiz through quickly, but you can't tell that closed source software doesn't have wide open bugs in it. until they are exploited in the wild by miscreants. So if you want to know that your software is tested, is secure, is safe, you want to be able to ask independent researchers to look at the software and the source code. You can only do that with open source. In open source, we can audit the code, we can test it, we can improve it. It's ours. Getting slightly more into the weeds on the more ideological side of why open source is good, brain scarcity, which is a sort of word I've coined to mean, brains are a scarce commodity. We shouldn't be wasting them by resolving a solved problem. So if we've got a platform that does order comms and somebody's had to create that with code and using brains and using clinicians, and there's lots of effort gone into that, and then another company do another one, and another company do another one, and there's a lot of Me Too software out there. Just it's another version of the same thing. Does the job less or more well than the previous one. It gives us a market we can choose from, but it's a massive waste of time and money and brains. And really, some of these things are so simple, like in the case of order comms or patient administration systems, or they are such a basic part of now running a digital healthcare economy that we shouldn't be spending money on them. These should be open source, large scale packages that just everybody uses. To take an example from the bigger tech world, people don't start a company in order to build a web server. A web server is such a basic piece of software now that it's something that you use as a commodity, and you might use an open source off-the-shelf one like Apache or Caddy or Nginx. But people would not think you were sane if you said, well, the first thing we're going to do before we start up our website is we'll build our own web server because we want a closed source one that we're going to build. That's just resolving a solved problem. People would think you were mad in the bigger tech world for doing that. But in healthcare, we do it all the time. We allow proprietary repeat solutions to pop up again and again. And it's a waste of brains. We could use those brains to solve new problems that haven't been solved yet. And there are many in healthcare technology that we haven't solved. So this is a famous hacker. Eric S. Raymond is one of the kind of father figures of the open source movement. And he describes that no problem should ever have to be solved twice. Creative brains are a valuable limited resource. They shouldn't be wasted on reinventing the wheel when there are so many fascinating new problems waiting out there. So that's an argument for do it once, fix that problem, solve that problem, and then just publish your solution. Give that solution away, make it open source, let other people use it, and they will improve it because your solution is likely not to be perfect. So now we all get a much better solution to a problem we all share. But much fewer of us have to solve that problem. And that means everybody else is free to go and address new problems. The NHS is ideal for open source. It's got a scale that actually means it would make a great place to build open source solutions. So we've got similar system-wide needs, and we've got hundreds of organizations, many of which are about the same size, and they have budgets, and they've got good organizational structures. They have access to hardware. We've got similar things across the NHS, and so we can identify the needs that are common, and we can start building solutions that would work across everywhere. It doesn't need to be, let's build the unified single NHS EPR record system, because I think that's where people sort of launch in mentally, and that is a hard problem to solve. But there are lots of smaller problems which we can solve with single small packages that just do one thing really well. And that's, the Unix philosophy, is have small tools that do one thing really well that you can compose together to achieve more lofty aims. we've got quite a large amount of development capability. And if it was working together, we could have dozens of really good, robust projects. We could build digital platforms to solve all our business needs. And these are just some examples that I thought of. Where is the operating system? Where is the website framework even? We currently have all the separate NHS organisations, each procuring or setting up their own intranets and websites, often using proprietary software. And they're doing that work again and again and again, instead of let's create a framework which makes every NHS website look like an NHS website. I know some work has been done on this in the NHS front-end framework, but it didn't go quite far enough to be able to create good quality functioning intranets, for example, where the search works and things like that. And so you've got situations where individual trusts will just say, well, let's use SharePoint or something like that. And so you have backward steps when we could be creating single good tools that do the business need of 80% of trusts, or 80% of the business need of all trusts, and get it reusable. And then those things can be improved by all of those trusts. And there's a workflow for collaborating and improving them. So yeah, the NHS does have the scale for it, but also in terms of its philosophy, the NHS is there to share risk of illness and share medical knowledge and sharing organizational knowledge. And yet we don't share the software, and we could be, but there is nobody in NHS leadership advocating for open source. So without that, none of the culture will change. We'll just carry on doing what we've done before. NHS staff also relatively readily get the idea of open source, because as the clinical staff have been trained in the idea of sharing medical knowledge and training the next generation. And you can't do that if it's closed source. You can't pass on closed source software. You couldn't pass on closed source knowledge. You can only pass on open knowledge. And in medicine, we have lots of open knowledge, and that's almost become the norm. So evidence-based medicine, for example, is based on open knowledge. That's something that I was trained in back in the 90s, before I even became a doctor. So open source is just that idea brought into the NHS, or brought into software. I think I probably already covered a bit of this, but these are the benefits of open source in terms of you can make it improve. I think that's quite straightforward. There are some myths about open source, which I covered off, I think, at the beginning. Yeah, the main one that I haven't covered yet is this idea that anyone can change your code, so it's inherently insecure. Well, that's just false. It's completely untrue. When you open source something, you still retain all the editorial control over the code. You've just given somebody a read-only copy and said, this is the code. They can't make changes and then put that into your production. They can offer you changes back if they've made some improvements, but you have the right of refusal. You have the complete control over whether you accept those improvements or not. Somebody might make a pull request, which is a way of making a change back into the original repository of code, and you might not agree that it's an improvement, so you can just decline it with no detriment to you. If, however, someone proposes an improvement, they find a bug, they fix the bug, and they say, here's the fixed code, you review that and you agree that's a fix, you now have free software development services. Somebody has just given you better software. Everybody's software gets better, and the overall, what you might call the total cost of ownership for all the organizations using this piece of software has gone down. It's got cheaper because we're all sharing the risk of making the software better, the financial risk, that is. So open source is the age of reason. If we want to do medical computing, there isn't any other safe and scientific way of doing it. I will quite happily debate people who have any contrary views on that, but as far as I'm concerned, that's an accepted true fact in all the rest of technology. It's just in certain niche areas of technology, like medicine, that where proprietary technology is still ringing the bell of, you can't know that it's good unless it's come from a big company. That's not true in the rest of the computing world. Open source is regarded as the only way to know that something is secure, and no better example exists than, say, the Signal messaging app, which is trusted as a secure encrypted messaging app purely because it's open source. And it's trusted much more than, say, WhatsApp, which is closed source. Interestingly, the Signal protocol is used by WhatsApp, and WhatsApp employed the originator of the Signal protocol to check that they did it right. But that's still not as good as having the actual source code to prove that they did it right. We just have to take their word for it. So Signal is open source, and that's one of the reasons we trust it. Open source gives you saved progress in the game of medical tech development. And I do feel for people when they've put a lot of effort into something and then some minor unimportant change results in them having lost all that progress because of organizational changes, changes of employer, changes of government. You can save your game if you open source it. And that's one of the reasons why I never do anything that is not open source now, because I don't want to spend any of my time and effort working on something that someone could take away from me because they just decide that that the project's no longer got a funding stream. Open source is an opportunity. You've just got to think about the business models. That can get complicated, but that's why people like me exist, to advise trusts and also suppliers on how to do open source right. And the NHS is absolutely ideal for open source. We just aren't doing it yet. So in true open source dogfooding manner, I use an open source framework called Reveal.js for my presentations, and I put some information about that in the description. But I'll bring it to a close just to say that, thank you for your time listening, and hopefully this will be the start of me starting to bring some of my presentations and some of the discussions that I've had at in-person events. I'm going to bring them into this channel and start to create some debate about them. It also puts them into a place where they're a little bit more easily accessible. And although I'm fully aware that YouTube is not an open source platform, there is a balance to be struck between using an open source video sharing platform, which do exist, but they're not very good, and having to hold your nose and use YouTube for the greater good of what I'm trying to achieve here, which is NHS open source. I don't really have to convince YouTube to go open source. It's not my role there. Anyway, thanks for your time, and I will share some links to some other videos that you might like to watch if you've enjoyed this. If you enjoyed this talk, here's some links to the slides. I'll put the actual working links in the descriptions or the show notes, but essentially there's a link to the slides, there's the source code if you're interested, and there's some of my other blogs. Now I will be coming back to these blogs and recording them as YouTube videos, because I think it's a nice way of getting them out there and just giving them an extra lease of life.